Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this third webinar series that we have as DGMT in partnership with the Initiative for Social Performance in Renewable Energy, otherwise known as INSPIRE. And very excited for today's conversation, which is going to focus on how do we deal with substance abuse and how do we unlock this renewable energy money that's community-based to actually shift things in those communities in terms of substance abuse. And I'm joined by a very knowledgeable panel, which I'll give a moment to introduce themselves shortly. But maybe just before we get into those introductions, I just want to paint the scene here. Why is this conversation important in the context of a webinar series that's focused on inspiring change, particularly with the focus on education? And the reason for its importance is twofold, right? The first is that I think when we think about what contributes to good educational outcomes, we know that brain development starts in early years, right? That 90% of brain development happens before the age of 5. And so if there are things that happen to hinder brain development before that age, like with substance abuse, you can have fetal alcohol syndrome, then you kind of have hindered the potential of that child to learn. But we know also in our schools, even if kids haven't gotten fetal alcohol syndrome, in many of our schools, children are abusing alcohol quite early on before their brains have fully developed. And that in itself, even at that later stage, can impede, I guess, their ability to learn. And for other social reasons, it can derail them from a particular life path. And so this conversation is very important in the context of a conversation around how do we enable our children to thrive in adulthood through an investment strategy that's focused on education. And again, it says education has to be thought of broader than what just happens in a classroom, right? And we have to consider social issues like substance abuse. And so that's just to set the scene. And so maybe then to help me, I'd like our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves. If you could just say who you are and what organization you work for, and briefly touch on the work that you do. I'll ask you, Zimasa, to kick us off, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zimasa Mpemnyama, as Usnazo has already said, and I'm the project lead for the Alcohol Harms Reduction Campaign at the DJ Marie Trust. And in my role, I oversee this project, which is aimed at advancing policy reforms that tackle alcohol harm in society. So the main focus is around creating an environment that curbs binge drinking and thinking societally and taking a societal approach to binge drinking, and while focusing on policy reforms and government interventions that can curb alcohol harm in the country. So yeah, I'll try and keep it there for now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Adrie, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to be here, and we are grateful for opportunities like this to discuss the work that we do at SAAPA National. My name is Adrie Vermeulen. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've been working in the field of prevention and treatment of substance use disorders for over 30 years. So it's always great to look at initiatives like this and how we can share our knowledge. The main aim of SAAPA National is to ensure that we've got standardized and quality programs across the board. So we invest a lot in making sure that whatever services we provide, we do it on a continuum of care. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but thank you so much for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Adrie. Nice to have you here in this conversation. Alet.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm from RSP. RSP, if we look what we are doing, we work at community-based organizations. We provide training, support, and mentoring to tackle the big substance abuse problems in various communities.
Great, thank you, Alet. And thank you for joining this conversation. Before I move on, I just want to say that we do have another panelist who just unfortunately has been struggling to log on. So in the event that somebody else joins, I will pause and allow her to introduce herself. But in the interest of time, I think let's get the conversation going. what I'm hearing from this group of panelists is that, you know, there's kind of a holistic and broad spectrum of expertise and angles that are represented here. One around community-based organizations, one around policy and legislation in terms of what Zimasa was talking about, and then the other from standardizing kind of quality of prevention and response and treatment services for people who are struggling with substance abuse, which is great because I think we understand that this is a wicked problem. And so no single solution is going to help us tackle this. Rather, we have to approach it quite comprehensively. And in the spirit of this kind of comprehensive framing, I know, Zimasa, you guys as a campaign have done quite a lot of research to really think about, well, what are the key drivers of this problem and what is an effective way that's been proven through research across the world to work, right? And you've come up with this, the best buys rather, framing. Can you please touch on that and tell us a little bit about what are the 5 best buys? Why do they matter in thinking about how do we tackle the problem of alcohol abuse rather? And you also mentioned something earlier about your focus is on binge drinking. So that's also quite an interesting framing, right? Because you're not saying that there should not be any substance use, but you are talking about a particular form of substance use, one that leans towards abuse of it, which is binge drinking. So can you talk about the importance of that framing, as well as then frame to us, what are the 5 best buys? Yeah.
So, so I was just noting down some of your questions. So I'll start with this. The issue around alcohol in South Africa is a very complex one, deeply complex, deeply historical, deeply social and economically entrenched in society. And that's not only just alcohol, but that's a substance abuse problem. But our focus is on alcohol because there's been research done locally and internationally that shows the turmoil that communities face because of alcohol specifically. And the fact that alcohol is usually not considered a drug or is usually not viewed as an entry point to drug use and substance use. And we usually just brush it off and talk about it as if it doesn't have the social implications that it has. And this research that we've done, both at the DG Murray Trust and other social partners and medical partners like the Medical Research Association, Council, and at the University of Cape Town, show that South Africa has a binge drinking problem, in the sense that even if a small population actually drinks alcohol, a large majority of the people that drink binge drink and drink to a level that is detrimental to their own personal health, but also detrimental to the social ecosystem that they exist in. So we have lots of young people drinking from the age of 15 and even younger. But what has been recorded has been from as young as 13 to 15. And as you mentioned at the beginning, this has psychological impacts and brain development impacts. And we have people from the ages of 25 to about 50 that are heavily, heavily drinking. And this has impacts on gender-based violence, on interpersonal violence, on workplace absenteeism, on traffic accidents, and many other social harms that have been quantified economically to say that this has a quantifiable impact on the economy close to billions, right? And so the reason why we then have a focus on alcohol specifically is because of the lack of regulation, the lack of policy reform, the lax way in which our government tries to tackle this issue. Our policing issue is an issue as well. And so all of these things coalesce, right? And so thinking about this problem, the World Health Organization then has kind of compiled a couple of policy interventions that can help and have been proven to help a number of countries across the world in tackling and curbing their alcohol intake. and therefore the harm that comes from alcohol. And these are called the World Health Organization's 5 best buys. And these include tackling trading hours, the amount of the hours in which we are allowed to buy alcohol as a country. Recently, there was a municipality in the Western Cape that increased their trading hours to 4 a.m. So they wanted to open nightclubs to 4 a.m. in the morning. And this is a small community where drinking and excessive drinking from very young ages has been detrimental for the community, right, which is a wine farming community. And so we took that municipality to court to try and get them to reduce those trading hours, and we won that case with the Western Cape High Court. So there's trading hours, there's looking at the pricing of alcohol, how much are we buying alcohol for, and using that as a tool to reduce the amount of alcohol that people drink. And there are many other reforms. There are about 5 of them, and we can go through them at a different stage. But the point here is that there are reforms that are possible, that have been shown to work internationally, have been shown to work. I was reading a study while preparing for this just now, in countries like Latvia and around Poland, where very recently they did a study for about 20 years, where they implemented these policies and have seen reduced levels of harm caused by alcohol. So this is possible, but it requires for us to have a government and policy systems that can allow for this to happen. And currently that is not happening.
Okay, that's really helpful. I guess I'm sitting here with the hat of working in the renewable energy space and in community development particularly. And oftentimes in our positions, we're so overwhelmed by the sort of the number of issues that obviously exist in communities, and it's impossible for us to have all those expertise. So it's really helpful to know that, one, there is this research that you guys have done, and that is available because many have done it, that really helps to frame what is the specific problem in this country. So I'm hearing alcohol as a specific unique substance, and I'm also hearing binge drinking as opposed to people should not drink at all. It's a particular kind of behavior. Then I'm also hearing that the research then shows, beyond now framing the problem, that its root drivers are around these 5 areas, right, which talk to policy and legislation around availability of alcohol, that speak to how easily trading times, to the price of alcohol, right? Because obviously logically now that makes sense. If it's cheaper, we buy more. And so that there is this kind of framework is the main thing that exists out there. And I guess for those in the sector, that's something that they could easily kind of draw on as a resource to get up to speed. But that's helpful, Zimasa, as a framing. What's also helpful about what you're saying is this idea that there is stuff that's possible to be done at municipal level, which is often the level at which we interface, right? Aadielah, welcome to this conversation. Could you briefly just introduce yourself, just saying sort of what organization you represent and the work that you do, very briefly, and then I've got a follow-up question for you, actually.
Sure, thank you, and apologies for joining late. I'm from an organization called the Southern African Alcohol Policy Alliance. We are an organization that brings together academics, researchers, community-based organizations, NGOs, concerned with alcohol specifically. And our aim is to lobby for evidence-based alcohol policies and legislation in the interest of public health and development. So we are not an anti-alcohol organization, but rather we are saying that we could promote drinking differently so that we don't experience the kind of harms that Zimasa alluded to.
Thanks, Aadielah. And I guess on that, can you just frame a bit more the uniqueness of alcohol from other substances? And then also talk a bit, you're making mention to policy and legislation, much like Zimasa did, which says to me that this is a systems issue more than it is a behavior change issue. And so can you also talk to what does then that systems change look like at a community level? The systems change that's required at a community level.
I mean, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that alcohol is a legal substance. And so that is a major issue for us. From any other substance other than tobacco, alcohol is the only other legal substance. And so what it does, it lends itself to some legal intervention or legislative intervention. The second thing is that we need to acknowledge that alcohol is not an ordinary commodity. And I think that's what Zimasa was talking to. It's not like milk and butter or milk and bread that people have every day. Alcohol is a substance that impacts on the individual, their own health, their own development, but also that of others. It causes social harm, like she alluded to GBV, child neglect. And so if we look at that as a framing, we need to understand that there's ways in which we need to look at alcohol differently from any other product, and why we need to get government to look at alcohol as a problem, or as a product. Let's look at it as a product that needs to be regulated in a way to protect people as individuals and society as a whole. And I think that's where we would say it's more a systems approach rather than an individual behavior approach that we should be taking. It's an intersectional issue. Alcohol at the moment is a developmental obstacle. It intersects with our own personal development, but also that development of families, development of communities, and development of South Africa as a whole. Because what it does, it diverts resources away from our development agenda. Currently, we pay between 10 to 12% of our GDP on alcohol-related harm. Government spends that. Families, together with government, spends that money. Money that we could be investing in education, in housing, in development, in getting kids to have access to recreational facilities that would allow them to spend energy differently from what they are doing currently by going to shebeens and taverns and drinking excessively. And that what that looks like at community and for us, it's about broader societal level, is that we need to look at what is the intersection of alcohol with any other development issue. So that if we are looking at spatial development, how do we ensure that the issues of alcohol outlets in any particular community is better regulated? In a study that was done by the Western Cape government in 2017 in Khayelitsha, they found that there were over 1,000 outlets in Khayelitsha, but only 10% of that was licensed.
Sure.
And that people live between 3 and 5 minutes walking distance to the nearest outlets. Now, this is children, women, men, adults, elderly people, everybody that lives in Khayelitsha can literally walk out of their door, whether or not they live in a more built-up area or an informal settlement area. They just need to walk down the road, or next door, actually. They don't have to walk down the road. They just have to go next door and they'll have access to alcohol. And that's one of our biggest problems that feeds into our binge drinking problem, is that people have access to alcohol in a way that is unbelievable. If you, me, and everybody else that's probably on this call live in communities where we don't have that kind of access. And we need to look at what does that mean for how we look at development within communities where the majority of people find themselves. Zimasa referred to the historical background, and we need to keep that in mind when we look at issues of development in alcohol. But maybe I should stop there.
Yes, thank you. No, that's very helpful framing, Aadielah, that's very helpful. Just while we're on the problem itself, we're hearing access again come up, which is really important. Adrie, can you talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of treatment and counseling services and prevention, but framing rather where are there gaps? What is the issue? What are we not getting right, so to speak there?
Yes, I think, Zimasa, thank you. Aadielah, it's great that you joined us because this is the team that you're looking at that was involved in a project that I think is very successful and exciting that we're continuing with. But I think from my side, we're listening to all of this and listening at where are the gaps, like you're saying, Zimasa, in terms of prevention, in terms of treatment. I think there's many gaps. And as we know, if we look at the root causes of substance use disorders, not only alcohol, but also all of your substances, we look at it as a multi-layered problem. So we start from a systemic point, we look at the society as a whole and our views on how we view, for instance, cannabis right now, how we view alcohol, how we view any of the substances, and it's more on a deep-rooted value system and a belief system, in a society. So one needs to look at how do we change the belief system of our whole society, how we approach it, from a historical point of view, where we have a relationship with alcohol, how it was introduced in our communities. We're seeing that even today, that this is the ongoing problem, so even if you look at something like mandrax, you look at any of the substances that was introduced in the apartheid system, that was all done for specific communities, so we look at this from on all levels, that there is historically, there is an influence on our societies where they're almost starting from on a back foot, because they were influences from a societal, political point of view that affected our communities as we look at it today. So
Sure.
it's about changing those perceptions, those belief systems that we have in our society. Then we move closer to our community that we grow up in, how our community views it. And we always say that community has its own identity, how they view it, what is normalized for them in their communities. So we also need to look at strategies that looks at the community and how do we build healthier communities, how do we build resilience in our communities that can not only address substance use disorders, but all sorts of societal problems that comes their way. And then I look at the family system, from looking from the family, what are we now seeing is that we don't have nuclear families, we have very dysfunctional families, very young parents, single parents, the many challenges that faces our children today, where they grow up in households where they almost the adults, and having to take charge of the family system. So our family system needs a lot of support. So I believe that we failed at not providing adequate parenting programs for parents to know how to be proper parents, how to look
Good
at
parents.
their roles and responsibilities as parents, and really taking care of their children. So I think there we failed, as a society. We need to strengthen that in our society. And then moving to the individual, that yes, there are very much a lot of influences on the individual, which stems from the system that they're part of. But for instance, trauma, we haven't addressed trauma at all, how trauma is affecting individuals, and also how generational trauma has been imparted in a lot of our people. So we haven't addressed that even, it's generations of work that needs to be done, to undo a lot of what we see now. So I think it's that's why we say it's a complex issue. There's no easy solutions to this. We can start with the individual, and that's where counseling and treatment lies, is with the individual and the family. But I do believe we need to look at more the community and the society as a whole. And that's where Aadielah comes in with her work, and Zimasa as well, in terms of legislation. How do we protect ourselves from a legislative point of view, and moving down to where the individual's rights are protected as well. So that is, I'm sorry, I took a long time, but that was just my understanding of it. Thank you.
That's very helpful framing again, right? Adding to this idea of the 5 best buys, but really helping to also just say overlay that structurally we have to think about it at those tiers, and that yeah, so that's super helpful. Thank you, Adrie. Speaking at the community level, I'm curious, Alet, what are you guys finding working with community-based organizations? What are some of the things that are issues that they are struggling with that hinder them from playing their role effectively in tackling this problem at a community level?
Okay, thank you very much, Naza. I think what we found is that they struggle because of sometimes there's limited knowledge on substance abuse, all right, and also skills and tools to assist. Now, also what we see is that they attempt to try to work on their own rather to network now, and to support each other. Now, so we see that they are actually working in silos. And because the problem is so big in South Africa, now it becomes overwhelming, and this then discourages them now to continue. Now, also what we find is that they have little or to no support. Now, if we look at the long waiting period now for inpatient treatment. Now, yeah, so I think that is the things that we find now if we look why they are struggling. Now, I think there's a lack of support, lack of resources, and they try to work on their own.
Cool. No, that's very helpful because now we kind of have the puzzle pieces about the problem itself, right? And some really helpful framing. I wonder if we can shift now our gaze to what are the solutions, right? What needs to be done across all of these layers of problems, right? Recognizing that what I'm hearing is that actually we have to kind of be thinking about this holistically, right? What do we do from a trauma healing perspective? What do we do in terms of at the individual? What do we do at the community level, systems level, etc.? So maybe starting at the systems and working our way down. I'm going to start off with you, Zimasa. What needs to be done? What needs to be done at all layers of the system, from national policy to then even at a hyper-local level? What are the priorities?
So that's a very complex question you're asking that requires a very complex answer, because as the speakers have already said, and Adrie spoke specifically to this about the multiple layers at which substance abuse erodes South African society, from the outside in, from the inside out. And mostly our perspective as DGMT and as the alcohol harms reduction project specifically looks at the policy and regulation space. So I'll focus on that. And the main thing here is around political will, that if we have political leaders and social leaders and societal leaders and community leaders that are not willing to step up to the plate to push for policy reforms that put public health first, then we will struggle for a long time to get the things that we need across the line. And those things include, as I mentioned, the 5 best buys around regulating trading hours, around regulating the advertising of alcohol on TV that makes alcohol and other substances, but specifically alcohol, because as Aadielah said, it is a legal substance, makes it glamorous, makes young people want to pursue drinking because all influencers have alcohol brands. So if you have political will, then you will have legislators that focus on the alcohol, on the advertising element of it. You'll have legislators that look at the blood alcohol concentration levels for drinking and driving and making sure that they're reduced to the right levels, right? So basically what I'm saying as one of the main solutions is having political people in office that have the political will to make the changes required for harm to be reduced. We've seen with the issue of tobacco around how some political figures were at the forefront of making sure that tobacco legislation was put in place. And we've seen how now societally as a country, it's difficult to find someone in an office with a cigarette, because of the policies that were put in place by specific ministers that were very adamant about the role that policy had to play in changing how public health is formed. So I think one of the main things is pushing political figures and pushing people that are in political office that have the power to make certain changes to do their work. One thing that really disturbs me is watching the budget speech every year and seeing how ministers cackle and laugh when they talk about the excise taxes and increasing it. And I remember this year watching it, the Minister of Finance was like, oh, it's gonna hit our pockets, and so you won't be able to buy whiskey anymore. And how in political office in parliament, the people that are legislating for this are not taking it seriously, to put it bluntly like that. Not taking it seriously, not seeing the weight of the decisions that they are making, and laughing about it and making it seem like it's this glamorous thing, right? So I think at the core of some of the solutions we need are societal-wide coalition forming institutions of knowledge sharing. I don't know, I'm just putting out words. And what this means is that government needs to come to the forefront, right? But we also need community leaders that are willing to step up to the plate. And this is difficult because we know that a lot of, sometimes we've come to see that tavern owners can threaten sometimes community leaders that want to kind of create change in communities. But you need a coalition of community leaders, a coalition of civil society leaders and young people that are willing to come to the fore to deal with the issue of substance abuse at the core, at the systems level, like we were talking about, and tackle it in that way. And that requires platforms like this, and requires platforms where we are sharing knowledge, like Alet said, that sometimes people don't know, right? So platforms where people can get the information that they need and share that information widely so that this coalition can move forward with a common understanding. And I think that's how in South Africa, as a people, we've been able to shift policy and shift things towards the right direction because we've collectively come together to work towards a common goal. And I think that's what's missing in this time around substance abuse generally, in that we are all scattered and we don't have a strong collective voice against it.
So it's really great to know that you are kind of holding this kind of sort of national and even to an extent provincial and municipal legislative type of policy reform advocacy. That's helpful. I'm sitting here and I think a lot of our listeners are going to be sitting thinking, well, what is our role? What can we get behind as just funders of community development? And I wonder if this is a helpful segue to you, Aadielah, right? For somebody who's sitting in that position, right? What initiatives can we put our money behind and at a community level that can help to either generate this demand, that create this leadership that Zimasa is talking to, that will begin to create this political will for legislative and policy reforms or action that can turn things around? And if you can talk to that particularly, like what are the opportunities at a community level specifically too, right? For those of us who are working at a community level.
Well, I think as everybody has said, this is a very complex issue.
Right.
And I think Adrie specifically referred to an accepted norm in our communities. And that's part of our problem, is that during the apartheid era, alcohol or commercialized alcohol was not allowed to be sold to Black people. And we need to talk about it in that way. This led to a culture of illegality, of buying from the back door, of being supplied in a way that is illegal. And that has led to an accepted way of living in communities. And so we're going up against a culture at community level. And the third part of that is that unfortunately our government has viewed alcohol as one of the few ways to get Black people back into the economy, which is an extremely narrow view. It's like the taxi industry. So if we get Black people to be involved in taxis and alcohol, then we've done our job. And that's part of our problem. So you have people living in communities that have been used to illegality, have been used to and don't want to go up against their brother or sister who is selling alcohol, because that's their way of making money and putting bread on the table. So at community level, we're dealing with different types of culture that has evolved. And our current government has fed into that culture. But one of the things that we could be doing is, one is getting people to understand that the current legislation, even though we are lobbying for change in legislation, but the current legislation affords communities rights to be involved in liquor licensing specifically. And that gives them the right to know what new liquor license is being applied for. It gives them the right to object to a application of a new liquor license, but it also gives them the right to object to a renewal of an existing liquor license. And I'm only talking about the legal components, because literally that's all that we can get people to engage in. Dealing with the illegal or the unlicensed alcohol sector is a completely different conversation and requires different engagement. But what we could be doing is getting people to understand those rights that the law does afford them, provide them with the information, provide them with access to that information. So literally every single provincial liquor board, and that's part of our problem, is that we've got 9 different liquor boards with different liquor acts that regulate the sale of alcohol in communities. And that's why the National Liquor Amendment Bill is so critical, because it offers the space to bring, to align provincial legislation with national legislation, and in turn get local municipal legislation in line with provincial and national, so that we have one system that is regulating, not 9 or 9+1, which is 10 systems that's regulating. If we get people to understand what their rights are and provide them with access to information, where every month the liquor boards advertise new applications, we give that to, and Zimasa has said it so beautifully, if we get a collective together of community leaders, getting them access to that information, getting them to understand how they can interact with that information, provide them with basic skills on how to engage with the system, where they can actually act on their rights, is a critical element. Because if we increase the amount of people that engage with the system will have to respond. They can't continue to ignore people. If we increase, and we talk about the tipping point, if we had an adequate enough amount of communities engaging with liquor licensing in every single province, the province as well as national will actually have to respond. And I think that would feed into this political will that Zimasa is talking about, is that we need to push, but we need to enable, provide people with the skills and the knowledge for them to push, because that push is not just going to happen from itself.
That's very helpful. And I think a lot of people in this sector do a lot of investment in skills, in upskilling communities. And so just to have that framing of like, here's an opportunity, and I know you guys do a lot of that upskilling, and I'm sure, and I know, Zimasa, you're aware of many other organizations. So that's a resource we can certainly share with the renewable energy sector, and like who to speak to if you want to know how to address this particular opportunity that Aadielah is referring to. Adrie, can you share a bit about, okay, what are the things, what has been proven to be effective in dealing with some of them at the individual level and the family level? What are those interventions that we can get behind and should get behind? Yeah.
Zimasa, yes, thank you. I think for that to happen, to work with the family and the individual, we have to see that they also functioning within the system that we're talking about the whole time. And I was thinking about your question about the investment. You know, what is the return on investment for people to invest in programs? And I think for any program, whether it will be on a systemic level or community level or family member, individual, it goes back to long-term interventions for me. You cannot fund something that is short-term, that we can't expect quick fixes like we're talking about in treatment, you know. It's a process to change belief systems, to change all of these attitudes towards substances, the politics around it. Zimasa was talking about that, you know, how do we get our leaders to be on board? So from my side, I think from an investor point of view, if you are funding any of the projects, you look at the long-term interventions. Number two, look at definitely research-based. It must be evidence-based, what has been proven. So there's many evidence-based programs for treatment and interventions in substance use disorder, many models that's also been proven to show that they work. So one looks at, for instance, the cognitive behavioral therapy approaches. You look at the SBIRT. SBIRT is the brief screening and intervention and referral to treatment from WHO. You look at that as a model to be used, upskilling everybody in a community, all your professionals in a community to be able to assess appropriately, to do the proper screening and to refer to the right treatment programs, you know. So for me, that is the crux of it, is to get the workforce to not only be a few professionals, but to expand this workforce, that we can have people in the community trained. And that's what Alet and them do very well, is to upskill CBOs, for instance, other NPOs, in providing prevention and awareness programs as well, but also to do that brief screening and referral to treatment. For me, that's crux in the treatment. It showed to work in other countries. We look at, for instance, the instruments that's used to assess properly. We look at treatment programs that's been found to work. We've got women's programs that are evidence-based. We've got youth programs that are evidence-based. So all of these must be based in research. So a lot of the investors forget about the research portion. You know, research is the crux for me. From the research, we are able to develop the intervention, and that is for me the most important part, and that you can then use that intervention, make sure that if I duplicate this in another setting, it will have the same results. So it must have that kind of development brought into it. Something else that I wanted to bring up, which touches on our legislation, is that we've got amazing legislation in South Africa. We've got the National Drug Master Plan. We've got the ideas on paper. You know, the solutions are there on paper. But the reality is it doesn't always transfer to in practice, you know, to what we need to do. We have alcohol harm reduction as part of the strategy. We have drug demand reduction as part of the strategy. We've got local drug action committees that's supposed to bring all these sectors together and that community bring about change. So it's about strengthening what we already have. I believe that we have the structures, we have the policies, we have everything in place, but how do we strengthen those systems that we do have? So that is where your collaboration and networking starts from, your advocacy starts from those groups. So for me, the LDACs are underutilized and underused at this point. They are supposed to be managed by the municipalities. And that's another challenge that we have, is municipalities don't understand their role in really strengthening these LDACs, because the LDAC can bring about change. You have to change the environment to assist the individual, you know, even with treatment. Treatment is a band-aid. You know, we have to make sure when that person goes back into the community, the family that they're from, that they're not going to relapse again. And we must put in protective factors in our society, you know, to make sure we do that. There's many research done on, you know, if like for instance with the Vietnam veterans that came back and that was addicted to heroin, the environment that they went back in strengthened them or actually defeated them. So it's about strengthening our communities, our families, so that we are able to support people with a substance use disorder. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrie. I'm in the interest of time, I just want to touch on one of the points that you made, which was you were really highlighting like a principle that funders need to embrace in order to effectively get behind work that works, right? Efforts that work. And you've actually highlighted two. One, you said we need to take a long-term view. Actually, a second one that's emerging and very clear, we have to take a holistic approach. We can't just look at sort of the one lens, be it legislation or be it treatment. So it has to be holistic, including all those tiers. And then the third that you're saying is that we have to search for where the evidence is. So unfortunately, if we want to tackle this effectively, we have to upskill ourselves in the knowledge and in the skills of what actually works. And we have to demand of whoever our partner is that they present the evidence, right, of what works. So those are three principles. And I wonder, off the back of that, Alet, could you highlight is there another principle that you feel like is important for funders to embrace in order for us to get behind the work that works?
Is it all right? Okay, thank you very much. So what we find, I want to start with two words now to make it really what I think is helpful. It's training and mentoring now, but so important that it needs to be sustainable. When we live of the training and mentoring process, that people have the skills and tools to go on to continue now with the programs. So what I think is there's for me three steps in the training process. The first step will be to provide them training on substance abuse and the process of addiction now to all the different role players. Now, after that training, what we then normally do is to provide them with the necessary tools and the facilitation skills to present information talks with the right information in the communities about substance abuse and the process of addiction. Now, normally then when you reach out now to the community, having these information talks, you will then find that there is a need for support groups, all right? Now, so the third step then will be to have support groups supporting in the community people that are addictive. Now, what we then find with this support group, it's so helpful because sometimes there's a very long waiting period for inpatient treatment. But while you are running these support groups, it's really very effective. Now, and we find that actually nationally, internationally, if you look like at support groups like the AA, they are successful and it works. Now, all right. So I think that is the three basic steps now as part of the training and mentoring process, and really to help with sustainability. What we also find with this training is that then the role players or the different CBOs start to talk to each other, now to share information, they start to network now, and they start to support each other now, and now they are working together because they know each other.
Thank you, Alet. That's very helpful just to give the sense of how we can empower our community NGOs who want to tackle this and what that process looks like. What are some of those ingredients, those critical ingredients? I just want to open it up to our attendees to see if there are any questions that anyone has before I continue with some of my own. If you could just raise your hand if you've got any questions or comments on what has already been shared. Okay, I don't see any hands up raised yet, but also please feel free to just put your question in the comment box and I will read it to our panelists. On this idea of how we need to approach this work in order to put our resources behind effective approaches, I wonder if, Zimasa, you have a view of any additional kind of principle that hasn't already been alluded to that you'd like to leave us with.
I think the main things have been mentioned that I noted down while thinking about this question around the idea of a long-term view, that when funding such interventions, because the issue is not a short-term issue, it requires a long-term solution as well, in that community interventions generally, whether they are substance abuse interventions or any other kind of community intervention, requires sustained community entrenchedness, if such a word exists. So I think the idea of the long-term view and the systemic approach to issues, I think, is important in the sense that when partnering with communities, but also partnering specifically with organizations like SANCA, like SAAPA, like RDSP as well, that are very intentional about the way in which they think about substance abuse is important, right? And not just doing a job, just for the sake of collecting people together and speaking about a problem, but people connecting with people that are very intentional about how they approach the issue. For instance, at DGMT, when we fund organizations, we fund organizations that are dealing with alcohol harm, but are very intentional in the way in which they deal with that harm, in how they provide counseling services to communities and how they think about community interventions and things like ALDEX and how they approach advocacy around alcohol.
Right.
And our one last thing,
Okay.
yes, one last thing around reiterating what Adrie had said around research, and that part of my work specifically is around making sure that there's research is possible and possible through funding, and that reiterating the importance of research, because research around alcohol is very limited in South Africa specifically, and making sure that there's funding available to do that is part of the core principles of what we do at DGMT.
Thanks, Zimasa. Sorry to cut you off. I do have 3 very good questions that have come up, but I'm going to read them all at once because they actually kind of speak to a similar topic. And I would just like to see by a show of hands who'd be interested in answering it. So I'm not going to throw it at anyone in particular. But here are the questions. How do these initiatives get introduced in schools? What recommendations are there on addressing this issue specifically in schools? And then lastly, what are the roles of school management and SGBs in this process, and how can we best support them? I hope you got that. Cool, I'll go with you, Adrie.
I'll start off, but I see Aadielah is on my heels. I'm going to say that schools are the main focus areas for us in the prevention work that we do at SANCA. So we work very closely with the Department of Basic Education, got a very good relationship with them, and we do interventions like the Kamoja prevention programs are rolled out specifically in Gauteng schools. Where it's also a job creation project where we take unemployed youth, we upskill them in providing the Kamoja programs in the schools. And it's done through the different grades. So really we build on the resilience of that child in terms of the using of substances. We find that with schools, it's a holistic approach. You have to start with the school policy, and that is got to do with your school governance boards as well, how they view it, whether they've got a disciplinary team that addresses any of the disciplinary issues around children that use substances, how they manage that, how they deal with it. It's very important to train your SGBs to do that as well. So it's a whole process. Also training your educators on how to identify the signs and symptoms of a learner that's using, and to distinguish between whether it is normal adolescency or problematic adolescency. You know, that's very important in the process. And eventually getting to the point where you also have peer educator programs in the schools that's peer-led, because we find that that's the best programs to work with. Peers are better with peers to bring about a message of change. So for us, it's about working with them as well. So I hope I addressed it. Aadielah, over to you. I know we've got a few seconds.
So I think I would like to look at the environment. The one thing that we need to look at, to add to what Adrie was saying, is that we need to get schools to have their own alcohol policy. where they discuss as a school community, whether that is from management, administrative, educative, or parent level, how they want to tackle the issue of alcohol so that everybody buys into what will happen as a consequence of any action. The second part of it is to be part of supporting the passing of the Liquor Amendment Bill. Because what the Liquor Amendment Bill does, it says that there should be no trading of alcohol within 500 meters radius of any educational institution. Because what that would do would allow children, or would reduce children's exposure to alcohol on their way to school and on the way back from school, but also it would reduce the access to both learners and educators, because we must remember that educators at the moment is part of our challenge. They are drinkers. They drink during school hours. They leave school to the shebeen opposite the school. They go into the shebeen. They share the shebeen with learners. So we need to begin to address the behavior of everybody in the education system. And maybe just in the interest of time, those two things for me is critical.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And thank you guys for that question. It is a pity that we don't have more time, because I think that there's a lot more to share. And there's a level of practicality we could also get into that really helps people understand some of the questions, like how then do you introduce this in a school? What is that process? And what are some of the critical, like, sort of conditions that need to be in place in a school for it to be, for this work to land in a way that the school owns it, right? And the school environment owns it. I mean, there's a lot of questions here. And maybe what we can do as a follow-up for our listeners, right, is we can package some case studies and some more detail that addresses some of those specific questions. And we'll be sharing, obviously, information about our key panelists and some of the resources they've come up with for this sector to digest and wrap their heads around. But for now, I will close it here and just say a big thank you to each of you for joining us and for sharing the wealth of wisdom and knowledge that you have. I think there are so many important takeaways that are quite big picture, but it is important to somehow start there, right? Because if we simplify this issue and we don't understand the complexity in the way you framed it, we might go wrong. And so I really appreciate all your time, and thank you so much to our attendees and for the exceptional questions. We will find a way to extend this, as I've said, so that, yeah, we continue to, yeah, get more knowledge that will help us to drive change in our communities. But thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.